Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. My name is Khaldun Azari. I'm the president of this club, and I have the honor to moderate this event. Our guest speaker today is Mr. T.W. Kang. He is a Korean Peninsula expert and managing director of Global Synergy Associates. And he's also a member of our club, so we are very lucky to have him to talk about the latest development in under the title of Is Korean Transition Manageable? We write that with reaction to the June 12 U.S.-North Korea summit, ranging from a historic and positive first step to an event lacking in substance. Attention is now shifting to the specific aftermath, and especially in South Korea, that has called the summit Act 1. It's a long drama, according to some description of it. From the experience of many nations that have transitions out of socialist regimes, one can easily see that economic security and military security are two sides of the same coin. Can Kim Jong-un become the next Deng Xiaoping of China and stay on power for unlimited time? That's a good question. We hope to hear some answer and insights. Mr. Kang actually he was on the board of US, Japanese, and Chinese firms, and he's an advisor to Fortune 500 firms on international strategies. He also the author of numerous books, including Is Korea the Next Japan? And he wrote a lot of analysis to various institutions. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our guest speaker, Mr. Kang. Thank
you. Mr. President, and fellow members of the FCCJ, and ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honored to be here today. It's been since 1990, 1991. I actually spoke like this way back then, and then that induced me to become a member of the club, and I've been a member ever since. And so many of you are familiar faces, and I'm very much appreciative to be here. My father, I should say on this occasion, who is a lifelong member of the club, he turns 95 tomorrow. And so it's a very timely time for me to come back and address a club, particularly because my father is from the northern side of Korea, and he somehow lived to see a summit meeting between North Korea and the United States, which is really an amazing that he survived this long to see that. I split my time between Japan, Seoul, and the United States. And thus I've looked at the situation from various perspectives, and it's quite different, depending where you are. And so I think I'll share with you a little bit the flavor. But to show you how, for example, in the United States, this has evolved, I remember a number of years ago, perhaps 5, I was entering the United States on my South Korean passport, which is the country of my citizenship. And I went to passport control, and I showed them my passport, of course, and the agent there, who looked at my passport, she looked a little quizzical, and so I was wondering why. And she picked up the phone and called secondary, which is the back office, who has more details. And she tried to speak kind of silently, but I could overhear what she was saying. She said, "South Korea, are they the good guys or the bad guys?" And after a few seconds, they said, "No, don't worry, they're the good guys." She said, "Stamp." I was in the country. I'm sure that lady wouldn't ask that question today. So anyway, that's what the what it used to be. In the past couple of years, I've been spending about a quarter of my time in South Korea, and the last time was very recently. I just got back last night, and so I was able to see. I was there for about 2 weeks, and so I was able to see the flow of what was going on from that angle. Now let me move on and give you a flavor of what it was like to be in South Korea, not only this time, but also these 2-week, 3-week stays, starting from some time ago. But let's contrast 2017 to 2018. Last year, I can tell you that since I also spent some time here as well, the atmosphere was very different between Japan and Korea, South Korea. You know, Japanese people are used to earthquakes. The South Koreans aren't, you know. And the South Koreans are used to having a military adversary across the border 40 kilometers away. The Japanese are not. But so, you know, the two sides can't understand each other. You know, you become so hyper about these things. But last year, the South Koreans were truly anxious about what was going to happen, with particularly potentially a preemptive strike that might occur as a result of U.S. policy, or actually reaction, potentially. The South Koreans, I could see that the South Korean citizens were taking this very seriously, because they were literally, citizens were talking about buying gas masks and how they should be, how far they should be away from a window if a nuclear hit happened. They were also asking their relatives, particularly those who had U.S. citizens as relatives, as soon as they hear about any kind of potential evacuation order from the U.S. military forces or the U.S. government, they'd like to have first bids on being able to cross the Han River. If they're north of the Han River, maybe some of you might remember during the Korean War, the bridges were bombed and people could not get further south, and there was a big problem during the Korean War. So people were really worked up about this. I could tell you in the United States last year, it was a very interesting. One other thing about South Korea. Of course, at the beginning of last year, 2017, we were also on the heels of the impeachment of the prior president, and so that was also a very dark mood. And the advent of whoever it was, a stable presidency was a welcome sign for the South Korean people. And so there was a huge contrast between 2017 and then in 2018, of course, things changed with, well, there were probably behind-the-scenes movement already in 2017, but with the New Year address of Kim Jong-un, I think things really started to kick into gear in 2018. Now, in the United States, I can tell you, just as a light remark, I was in California last year, somewhat after President Trump came into power, and I was in a kind of a scenic spot in California called Half Moon Bay, and an American person walked past me, and we were strangers, and he actually started talking to me and said, "How do you like having Hitler in the White House?" And I was quite amazed. Well, California's a liberal state, of course. But then two other things, maybe more relevant, is after the fire and fury comment that Trump made, I was in a Palo Alto bookstore. This is not right near Stanford University, if maybe you're familiar. The owners of the bookstore were saying, "Gosh, our president, what does he want to do, start a war?" And then he said, "If those missiles come and hit us," and these are ordinary store owners, he said, "we're toast." So, you know, that's a change. And then remember the passport control story I gave you. The PBS NewsHour every day broadcast at night their news stories. They said, they used to call, of course, South Korea and North Korea. But as soon as they started using the terminology, the North, habitually, I said, my goodness gracious, is this really starting to get on the radar screen in the United States? You know, when you say the North, and it means North Korea, it's a pretty, this issue is really starting to come online, so to say. Now, 2018, in South Korea, there's now a lot of hope and some euphoria. And I can tell you maybe one instance of this is that north of Seoul, there's an area called Paju, which is right near the 38th parallel. In fact, it actually, it's right on the edge of the 38th parallel in some parts. The land prices in Paju, some parcels, not all, but some parcels of the land prices and lands in Paju have gone up in value 4 times since the beginning of the year, in anticipation of some sort of economical rapprochement between the South and the North. And that's a very interesting, the fact that euphoria has taken over. I don't know whether euphoria is rational or irrational exuberance, but it is some sort of euphoria going on. I think there's a set of part of this euphoria is the following. This is a sense that I hope I can maybe relate to you, and that is the following. You know, if you are a South Korean, and this is a little different from being in this sense, because you're right on the Korean Peninsula, geopolitically speaking. I recall this comment that one of our longtime colleagues here, who is now a late colleague because he's passed away, but you probably remember Sam Jameson. He was a real watcher of the Korean Peninsula. I had long discussion sessions with him, and he said something really very observant one time to me. He said, you know, you South Koreans, if you ever have a chance to get something that's somewhat close to what you want, the circumstances are going to have to be very extraordinary, very, you know, not ordinary, because coordinating the vested interests of 6 parties that are surrounding you, or including you, of course, but is almost impossible. And you're not going to get what you're probably going to want. Well, these circumstances that I think we're in are quite extraordinary in many ways. And so one is that there are 2 key elections in this year. One is the regional elections that just took place in South Korea, which I'll come to in a second. The other, of course, is the midterm elections in the United States. So you've got 2 leaders who really want to get something done, and they have political vested interest in this thing. So that's a very interesting factor. The second, of course, I won't dwell on this very long, but we have a very unordinary president in the United States, right? This is a very interesting. Even Christopher Hill, who many of you probably have heard of, he was a key negotiator in the past on these nuclear issues. He commented that the President Trump has unusual focus on the North Korean or the Korean Peninsula issue, and he's willing to take risks to accomplish what he wants to accomplish. Now, what's interesting is that recently South Korea did a big data analysis on President Trump's tweets, and at one time, 23% of President Trump's tweets had to do with the Korean Peninsula. That's a pretty big share of mind. And so that's a very interesting point. Another thing that's kind of interesting is that it's difficult to negotiate with North Koreans. And one of the more cynical ways to sort of put this is that I remember a long time ago, the Harvard negotiation method guys came and they went through this whole presentation on how to negotiate tough negotiations. And somebody got up at the end and says, "Does your method work for the North Koreans?" And the guy said, "Well, that's kind of difficult, you know." But I contrasted that with David Brooks, who is a political commentator for the New York Times. He recently appeared on a program in the United States. And when he was commenting, he said, of course, I'm never really sympathetic to Trump, but this time I have something nice to say about him in the context of negotiating with North Korea. He was a real estate man, and in the real estate business, you have to deal with a lot of thugs. And, well, he's making that capability quite apparent in dealing with Iran and North Korea. And so this is very interesting because he has a different technique from dealing with North Korea than some of the other presidents have had, and that's also quite extraordinary. I think North Korea's change of direction is really interesting as well. I've always thought that if you place yourself in the shoes of Kim Jong-un, you know, your grandfather and your father died let's say, arguably, some people argue about this, but a natural death. This man he's still in his 30s. He's probably got a couple of decades to go, maybe 3 decades or maybe 4 decades to go. And the question of whether he can sustain himself that long under the current scheme is something that he's got to think about a lot. And so that's something that that's going on. But also, I think his policy, and I will come back to this, but his policy called the Byungjin policy. Byungjin means parallel step forward, parallel progress. Parallel meaning nuclear, military development on one side and economic reform and development on the other. That policy, it's difficult to sustain both at the same time, particularly with all the sanctions that have been placed by the United States. And I think that's maybe a factor. Those two things are maybe factors in why he may have wanted to make a directional change here to some extent. Now, the earliest winner of captivating or capturing this particular set of circumstances was Moon Jae-in. June 13th, the day after the Singaporean summit, he won a landslide victory in the regional elections in Korea. He took 14 out of 17 regional seats, and his party, the party in power, took 23 out of 24 wards of Seoul. In fact, 3 wards south of the Han River, which were purportedly against the progressives in the past couple of elections, turned over and became progressive this time. So he has really gotten what he wanted, and now it's Trump's turn to try to get what he wants, I suppose. So that's what we've got there. Now, let's go a little bit further in timeline here. There was a very interesting debate, let's call it, in South Korea between special advisor to Moon Jae-in. His name is very similar to Moon Jae-in, but his name was Moon Jung-in. He's a very, very expressive person, but he says a lot of things that's very revealing in some ways. And then the counterpart was a person called Song Min-sun. He was a former foreign minister of South Korea who took part in many of the denuclearization talks in the past. Now, these people talked about, they mentioned a number of key words during their interchange. One was asymmetry of experience, which came up very interestingly. The North Korean diplomats who are involved with these negotiations, particularly Kim Gye-wan and Chen Chesani, these people have been around a long, long time. You know, these people have been dealing with the denuclearization relationship, renewal of relationship, these common issues that are coming up time and time again nowadays in the newspapers and on television. Since maybe 1992 or something, 1992 with South Korea, 1994 with the U.S., 2002 with Japan when the Koizumi visited, in 1905 with the six-party talks, 2012 with the United States. It's the same parameters that keep coming up. And these guys have stayed on the team, and they understand the history of this. The U.S., yes, there are members, there's still people around that remember this, but they're not necessarily on the team. So they have to go look up what has happened, and these people on the other side of the table, they remember what the proceedings were, and that's a very interesting asymmetry in this particular situation. The next set of next keyword that came up was rollover. Well, it means commitment for commitment, action for action. And I'm sure that as we speak, Pompeo and all these other people are working on all of this. Of course, the key issue for the United States is the I and the VI that were missing and the CVID, and I'm sure that's what they're going to focus on. The coverage in the South Korean press says that the North Koreans were interested in a liaison office kind of arrangement, and Trump thought it was a little bit too early given the parameters that were being discussed. And so that may be one of the things that, but there's got to be this quid pro quo over time that's got to happen. Another point from the U.S. side is what's called in keyword language front loading, and that is how do we compress the timeline here by, for example, many of you would probably know, instead of doing all of the CVID on the Korean Peninsula, you take the weapons that are as identified or declared unidentified, and you try to bring them out of the country and do the rest of the process maybe in the U.S. or so. Now, another issue was the issue, and this is an issue theme that I'd like to continue as we move forward, but the question of trust and chemistry. This is very significant because, of course, in any negotiation, and think about a situation where you have a hostage and a ransom, and everybody says in the classic case, you got to release the hostage first, and then I'll pay you the ransom, or you got to pay the ransom first, and I'll release you the hostage, right? But it comes into this kind of a pattern, and so this trust and chemistry, I'm going to trust you to do something, and then we could move forward, is something that happens only after personal chemistry takes place, and so on. I think that it's interesting that when Chung Eui-young, the national security advisor for South Korea, covertly went to Pyongyang, reportedly Kim Jong-un told him that I recognize how the international community views me. And that is with question and with distrust and this kind of thing. And so at least that side, they realize this, and it's something that needs to be worked on, and so on. So there is a problem, and that is question, obviously, that probably is on many of your minds as well, is the realistic possibility that Kim Jong-un might actually hold on to a minimal amount of nuclear weapons until he's totally satisfied that he gets what he wants, or maybe after he gets what he wants. And that's something that we have to probably reckon with, either in the negotiation phase or later. Now, some dates, I think as we move forward, some dates that might come up that may be milestones or checkpoints for how this could unfold is, one is July 27th is the 65th anniversary, I believe, of the Korean War armistice, the ceasefire. And so that would be a symbolic date to try to see if a declaration of the end of the war could be achieved. It may not, maybe there's not enough time to do it, but it could be a date which could be the end of one phase. In August is, of course, when the Ulchi Freedom Guardian military exercises that Trump offered to put on hold was to take place. So that's considered to be an act of good faith. September, of course, is the 73rd United States General Assembly, and there could be some action that takes place in and around those sessions. And of course, November is the midterms. Now, the midterms might be important because some of the things that are being negotiated need to be ratified by the U.S. House. And some of them need 2/3 approval by the House. So if we pass this date, it might become, the U.S. side might actually become more constrained, and they may use this as a negotiating leverage against the North. Now, last segment of what I wanted to mention before I take questions here is further on. Now, getting to, and we don't know if we can get an agreement or not. That's still an if, and it's also when, but and maybe not, and maybe if not, then we go back to 2017 perhaps, or what have you, and hope not. But let's say that there is some kind of agreement and we can actually move forward. Well, this is a very interesting situation because I think sustainability of North Korea and the current regime is dependent probably on economic factors. Now, people talk about security guarantees and security assurance. And of course, there are two types, as I understand. One is called negative security assurance, and the other one's called positive. Negative means somebody doesn't do something to you, for example, attack or invade or this kind of thing. Positive means, can you help sustain ourselves, whether it be economic aid or cooperation, what have you. Now, there's already been some posturing on this issue. You might know that in the April 27th summit between Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un, during one of the sessions, or maybe during the walk or something, Moon Jae-in handed a USB to Kim Jong-un that's got a presentation about the South-North economic vision. And that this, they call it a new economic map, but it's sort of, if you superimpose the letter H on the Korean Peninsula, you can sort of visualize it, and the right vertical line would be on the east coast of North Korea, and that's apparently the natural resources road, so to say, going north. And the west vertical line is going north, south-north is the industrial production line. So there'd be a lot of factories and ports and rail lines going that way. And then there would be the horizontal bar would be the bridge between the two parallel roads. And superimposed on that, of course, is the Eurasia rail vision, which would extend that H all the way across the Eurasian continent, hopefully with the target being Europe, but all the areas in between as well would be an opportunity. And so there's already movement in that direction. And then of course, the latest, it's sort of more of a maybe a little bit further out, but the South Korean government is thinking of even what people call Industry 4.0. This is the stuff that, in layman's language, includes AI, big data, IoT, these kind of technologies, trying to use this as leverage to really accelerate economic integration between the two. Now, the North Korean side, I think, also has also rumbled a little bit about this from the information I've gained. There's been conversation between Kim Young-chul and Pompeo and Trump about Wonsan and developing Wonsan as a tourist destination, a casino development over there. Well, you know, these guys are not stupid. They know Trump had experience with casinos, and they probably wanted to ask him for some advice. And the surprise walk that Kim Jong-un took on June 12th in Singapore, viewing places like Marina Bay Sands and things like this. This was also, some say, a show that he was interested in tourism and tourist development and so on. And I think if you look at some of the reports from the Western side, Trump has also picked up on this theme, and alluded that you could look at the North Korean economic development situation as from a real estate perspective, that North Korea is actually between two very attractive economic locations, that is China and South Korea. Very good real estate, he said. Now, let's look at, just briefly, positive aspects of the North Korean economy and some handicaps or what have you. Very briefly, positive aspects of the North Korean economy is that, you know, ever since the 1990s, when the rationing system fell apart, the underground markets have become more formalized, and now the Jangmadang, they call it, the outdoor markets and so forth, are ubiquitous, and those people who have made money either from that or from the other type of liberalization is that the state-owned enterprises that have actually produced, according to plan, the overflow production they can sell. And so there have been some people who have become quite wealthy with this, and now they call these people Tonju, which means the Lord of Money. So there are people like this that are starting to come up. Now, the other thing that's, I think, a kind of a positive is that, you know, after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, I think Henry Kissinger made a very interesting comment, and that is that while there are textbooks for how capitalist developing nations develop to become advanced nations, there are no textbooks that show how developing socialist nations turn into advanced capitalist nations. Well, the good news is that since then there's been a couple of decades now, and there are many examples which can be benchmarked. The foremost is the People's Republic of China, of course, which, well, as we speak, Kim Jong-un is there, I think. So that's an interesting thing to look at. Now, I hasten to come to the handicaps. The handicap is that they have an awfully late start. You probably might know that Deng Xiaoping talked 5 times to Kim Il-sung about doing reform and open up. And only the last 2 times did Kim Il-sung actually consider even looking into this. But unfortunately, as he warmed up, he faced his death, and Kim Jong-il at the time, who came into power, in order to consolidate power, had to pull back. And that was a very unfortunate thing, but it pushed the process further and further back. And so now they have very few internationally competitive products, and, you know, while the advanced nations keep advancing, it's very difficult for them to catch up. Now, second is the point about trust, and I think you can understand that. We talked about that before. If you just look at the Kaesong industrial complex and how the rug got pulled off from underneath, you can see, if you remember the pictures of all the cars that were stuffed with inventory and production equipment that they had to carry back into South Korea. Think about the dislocation and discontinuity and the disruption that caused. Now on to the key point that I want to mention here is, and that relates very much to the question that I asked in our introduction, and that is, how do you balance the opening up that is caused by something akin to a reform and open up policy with the authoritarian regime that Kim Jong-un has today? That is very difficult. Now, the difficulty lies because, now you might say, well, China is also quite authoritarian, but they've managed to reform and open up. But remember that North Korea has several different sort of pockets in its budget. You know, one is a bucket for Kim Jong-un and his family, another one for the military, and another one for the general economy. People have called it different names, such as Office 39, or Bureau 39, this kind of thing, and the second economy, and so on. Now, if you think about the fact that loyalty to Kim Jong-un is directly proportional to the give and take that happens using this type of economic resources that are gained from foreign currency transactions that both the party, the military, and the government is making, that if that type of thing starts to dry up, this starts to really make it very difficult for them. And so that's, if the opening up happens, then that becomes, the balancing this becomes very, very difficult, and we need to do. And maybe I make the last point, and then we'll go on to, I'm watching the time here. That balancing is very difficult, and we have to watch that. The other point is that clearly this whole process is going to take a lot of money, and I think there may be some other guests coming to the club that may address this in more detail, but we're talking about billions of dollars just to denuclearize, and then maybe hundreds of billions to build the economy back into shape. You know, South Korea has some budget surplus, but it's not going to be anywhere enough to fund this. And the question of where these funds are going to come from, and whether Moon Jae-in, the progressives in the Korean government, will try to take as much from the South Korean companies and the haves versus the have-nots, will be an interesting picture going forward. The question of whether Deng Xiaoping's tolerance for creating some differential as a development takes place, whether that will be tolerated by the progressives in Korea will be very interesting to watch. Well, anyhow, let me stop my comments at this point. I think I'd like to believe that where there is a will, there is a way. But I think the road there is going to be quite treacherous. Well, let me just end by saying my best wishes to the Foreign Correspondents Club. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your insights. Q&A session starts with Anthony.
Anthony Rowley, freelance. Welcome to the club again. Very interesting. North Korea is said to have very substantial mineral resources sitting beneath its mountains. I can't give a full inventory, but there's an awful lot of them. I've seen one estimate that they could be worth up to $10 trillion US, which happens to coincide with what some people think the cost of renewing the Korean economy. But I mean, the question is, what could they do with those minerals? I mean, do they have the resources to exploit them, to turn them into products, or don't they? And if so, if they don't, then they're going to require foreign assistance in doing that, presumably.
Good question, Anthony. Thank you. You know, that's an open secret, so to say. I mean, we all know that North Korea is rich in natural resources, And there are multiple parties eyeing this. The new economic roadmap, or the map that Moon Jae-in showed in that USB, that eyes the resources you're talking about. Of course, you probably can imagine very easily the Chinese are also looking at that. And what this is very, very interesting, because these minerals, they're not easily, you have to excavate them. And it takes money to do this. It doesn't come for free. And so you have to have some sort of arrangement to do this and some investment to do this. And I believe that in the past there have been some arrangements with the Chinese where they've taken they've entered into agreements to do some of the stuff. What's going to be interesting, because many of these agreements between the Chinese and North Koreans are opaque, to the international community. We don't know what they agreed to. But I think if you look, for example, across the border from North Korea into China, the Jilin province is actually amongst the three provinces in northeast China. It's one of I think it's the poorest province, actually. So they would really benefit from having some kind of synergy from what you talked about, Anthony. So they're really interested in this, and I'm sure that if there's a railway that goes right across Eurasia, that there'd be more countries interested in this kind of arrangement as well. So yes, there's enormous potential. The question of how the benefits are going to be apportioned is going to be a big question as to how this will turn out, I believe.
Thank you. So let me ask, where is Japan stands in all of this? There are reports that Japan is isolated. Japan's diplomacy didn't work, and now Japan is just following the herd. So how do you describe the Japanese situation and position now? Thank you.
I thought, and I think it's an interesting question you raise. A number of years ago, I attended several conferences in Japan, inviting not only South Koreans, but North Koreans and Chinese and Russians, called the Kan-Nihonkai Keizai. This is a Sea of Japan. Of course, I should say, since this is official, that the Koreans call Sea of Japan Donghae East Sea, but let's say from the Japanese side, Sea of Japan, the Pan-Sea of Japan economy. I believe that, given my comments earlier to you, that Kim Jong-un brought up wonsan as a very important, and Kim Young-chul also brought up wonsan. The wonsan is a very strategic location in the Pan-Sea of Japan, Pan-East Sea area. Now, I would think, given its strategic location, that Japan would be one of the more aggressive, would want to be one of the aggressive participants in this area. And I think that's an opportunity for the Japanese, but I think what has happened instead is this abductee issue has come to the fore. And so this is a situation that's relatively sensitive, because you can see that in South Korea, in South Korea we have many times the number of abductees. But whether it's right or wrong, we can argue about this, but the current administration has decided to not bring this on the table right now as negotiations. And neither has Trump, actually. He hasn't talked about human rights issues so far, okay? And so if Japan, without talking about this type of economic initiative, continues to just sort of focus on this one issue, then I think it becomes a very difficult kind of engagement, diplomatically speaking. I hope they take a broader approach to this particular situation.
Thank you. Anthony again.
If all goes reasonably well, presumably at some point people are going to start thinking seriously about the reunification. How do you reunify a country which has not only two completely different systems, but two different presidents? I mean, there's going to have to be some massive adjustments there. Just speculating, looking forward, what form do you think reunification could possibly take?
This will be a very speculative kind of subject, because the current South Korean president does not believe, I don't believe, I have his official statement on Moon Jae-in's policy on the Korean Peninsula, and he doesn't talk about a quick reunification of the land. Much of the South Korean populace, they shudder to think about the burden that it would take to actually reunify the land in a very abrupt manner. Now, my generation and above wish for reunification. There's, of course, a number of us. For example, I mentioned to you that my father comes from the northern half of Korea, and so we have split families, and we'd love for the countries to come together. However, as you correctly point out, Anthony, if you look at the history of Korea over centuries and centuries and centuries, the one outstanding, or I should say outstanding meaning something that's really stands out, part of Korean history is that, as contrasted to Japan, is that Japan is a culture where if you have party A and party B, you try to do A plus B divided by 2. You try to average out the differences. Korea is a exclusive or B kind of place. If you're A and you're B, either A takes over B and that reduces the redundancy, or B takes over A and does the same thing, reduces the redundancy. That's the kind of place it is. So the question of who's going to take the initiative and so on is an interesting situation. Now, of course, there's people have worried, even recently, and this is part of the reason, not all, but part of the reason why the reduction or removal of U.S. troops from the Republic of Korea is such a big issue, is once those troops are removed, it heightens the possibility that the initiative could be taken by the North. And if that type of scenario happens, then I was in Vietnam a number of years ago, but it's like North Vietnam taking over the South, and it took a long time for that socialist nation under the Doi Moi policy to kick its economy back up. Now, I hope that scenario doesn't take place, because the peninsula already has an economic, a fairly advanced economic nation in the southern half of the border. So I hope something will happen in that manner. But I think it's more realistic, Anthony, to think of if we come closer to that type of a scenario, of a one country, one state, two system type of scheme first. And some sort of a soft landing scenario rather than a merger and integration, or a Germany type. I think we have some gentlemen here, but Germany type of a reunification scheme.
My regards to your father.
Thank you. Thank you.
Please.
Siegfried Needle, freelancer from Germany.
Yes.
There was no clear result or no exact concrete result in the negotiation from the what they want to achieve, the United States and North Korea. They want to So only a kind of a commitment to denuclearization,
Yes.
for denuclearization. But this is very not concrete. Very. Nobody, everyone can understand what he wants with this term denuclearization. But there is people. What I read is it was the South Korean President Moon who gave the advice to President Trump not to have this kind of going this way in the discussion.
Go in which way now?
The discussion, and not to want a concrete result in the negotiation, because perhaps this is not possible. To have only a kind of a common understanding what to do in the further negotiation, and so many people say North Korea has won. They won in the negotiation because that's what they wanted. No concrete result, only a kind of common understanding. We want to denuclear. But do you think is it possible that this was in reality also a strategy of the South Korean president to negotiate in this way?
Okay. That's a very good question. It's my thought that, South Korea is Moon Jae-in of South Korea has characterized his role, or his government's role in respect to this set of events, as South Korea in the driver's seat. Now, there's been a lot of criticism about that because, the main players in the Singaporean summit was not South Korea. As a matter of fact, Moon Jae-in wanted a trilateral summit, but I believe he couldn't make it, right? That would have been in fact, if that coincided on June 12th, it would have been the ultimate show for Moon Jae-in for his election the next day, but that did not happen. So that's one thing. Now, however, I think that you can say that South Korea played a good role as an enabler and a catalyst in this particular situation. They may have not been the main actor, but they played a facilitating role. Now, as to your question, in terms of, in some ways, maybe prolonging the timeline a little bit. Now, I don't say that this summit was futile in any way, because, it brings to the close one last remaining issue from the 20th century Cold War. Really, the only place that's divided, that's left, is the Korean Peninsula. So for the antagonists of that war to actually talk together is a very historically significant thing. But it's only as you point out correctly, it's only the first step, and there's a long road ahead, right? Now, I suspect, sir, that the guys that really put the pressure through indirect means to slow the negotiations down and make it, remember the point about the United States wanted a one-shot kind of a deal, and North Korea said we wanted to do a staged kind of deal, tit for tat. Remember that when Kim Jong-un visited China, China agreed with that it should be a staged kind of deal. And I think as we speak, they're probably discussing this kind of thing. So my suspicion, sir, is that it's not South Korea that's really the strong leverage behind this. It's really China that's behind the scenes pulling the strings on this thing with North Korea.
Yes. ask until you find the question. Do you think the worst case scenario is a war, because there were a lot of talking about wars, or the United States would conduct a surgical operation against certain sites? But I remember you told me many times that war is absolutely not an option, because powers like China and Russia will not allow it in the region, and it's destruction for the East Asian economy in general. So do you think the option of war is totally out of picture right now?
Well,
Or attack, not necessarily war, just military attack, small attack?
yeah. You know, I think that as I look at the situation, you know, you've got the United States is right now in a situation, as you know better than me on this particular subject. They're in Afghanistan right now, and I understand their engagement in Afghanistan is now longer than the Vietnamese War. And they've got a situation in Syria that's very well. You're very well aware of this. That's not trivial, and the Russians are involved in that as well, and they've got a lot of interests in the Mideast. I wonder if even Trump, with his spontaneity and all those things, would like to get into another war in this side of the world. That's going to be an extremely complex war. The Chinese are, I shudder to think what the Chinese would do in this situation, and so on and so on. Okay, it would involve Japan. It would involve, of course, South Korea. It would involve many areas, and the vested interests are very complicated. It will not be a quick war, for sure, and it will not be a war only with surgical strikes. So it'll be a very nasty kind of war, and I think the Americans, I think even Trump, will think very hardly about it. You know, even before. I understand that Trump, from the South Korean press, they say that Trump, after the Fire and Fury, around the Fire and Fury comment, the Pentagon and the National Security team drew up 20 different scenarios as to what's the minimally destructive way of doing a preemptive strike. But they didn't. You know, it's really. It says that, for example, many of you know this, but just in case, I think in all scenarios, Seoul suffers quite significantly with all the artillery that comes across the border and so on. So you can't. There's going to be some immediate destruction, no matter what kind of strategy you take, and so. You can't do this very easily because they're also U.S. citizens in these places, and so you take out not only the local populace but also U.S. citizens. So you got to coordinate an evacuation plan, and you got to do all sorts of things before you can actually do a very effective preemptive strike. And so the Pentagon and all those guys are, I'm sure, thinking about all this, but it's not. It's one of those. Differential equations that are really difficult to solve. Maybe too many constraints. So I hope not, and I hope that the U.S. Administration's rational enough to not go that way. There's a jump.
Yes, both after him.
Hi there, I'm Richard Carter. I'm from the AFP News Agency. Thank you very much for your talk. It seemed very positive, which is quite refreshing. I was actually down in Singapore, and the prevailing view from the experts there was that the summit had made the world a more dangerous place. That Trump had given away the exercises, that they'd dropped the V and the I in the CVID, and that he'd given away the House without really getting much back in terms of concessions from a North Korean side. So really I have a very general question for you, rather following up from Calvin's point. What do you see as the end game? Where will we be in a year's time, 2 years' time? How do you see the process? I know it's difficult to predict, and it'll be a long and drawn out process, as you rightly say, but where do you think the end game is for both parties? Thank you.
Well, that's a very prophetic question. Let's put it that way. Prophetic question, and you can take a very well. You characterize it as a positive view of it, and I would say try to be a little fair to myself as well. That I'm taking a cautiously positive view. That I did say, remember, if there's a will, there's a way, but the road is treacherous, and that equal a carefully positive view. Now, if you take a negative view, you can say any number of things. I mean, my friend over here said a war. We can fall back to 2017. We could have there were two scenarios brought on by let's see, what did he say? He said there's one scenario that was brought about on NHK. I think a certain commentator was saying that we could have a everlasting sort of no progress type of situation as in the past. That's another scenario, right? That was on the Japanese networks. All those scenarios are possible, okay? But I believe, as I said earlier in my speech, that the circumstances now are actually unusual. And I think you're right that if it were a usual circumstance, that the agreement would be a little bit hollow in its content, but I think the circumstances are unusual. And as I mentioned in my speech, you got several timing sort of deadlines. I mentioned, right, July, August, September, and November. And I think that negotiations can take place during those windows of time to see whether progress can be made or not. And I think November would be one kind of an endpoint. And if that doesn't happen, then I think there may be the weight could fall more towards the pessimistic side. But I believe that we should wait and see to see how this unfolds until that period of time, because I think Trump does have some political motivation to create something. Because if he doesn't, after all this noise, you know, by midterms, I think you well know quite well that if when I'm in the States, you look at the domestic news in the United States, and there's not a whole lot of good news over there. He really needs a win here, you know. So I'm willing, as a South Korean citizen, to put my bet on that to see what happens, but we don't know. Okay.
Süddeutsche Zeitung, Neidhardt. I came in late, so I apologize if you had already addressed that. Moon Jae-in obviously is the facilitator, as you said, especially in the beginning. The Chinese came in much later than Moon with trying to get things moving. Now, Park Geun-hye had a love fest with Xi Jinping. The relations were never as good as under Park Geun-hye. That's probably the only positive thing she ever achieved. And with Moon, it's kind of a big question mark. But obviously, Moon was the chief of staff of No Mo-young. And there, the anti-Americanism in South Korea was big, and South Korea has no reason to trust the United States on the long run. So isn't the crucial point what's going to happen now between Seoul and Beijing, and what will happen?
Okay, good. That's an interesting question. First of all, you know, there's a Japanese writer. He's with the Nikkei group. He's written about four or five books saying that North Korea has taken, or sorry, South Korea. I keep saying North. South Korea has taken this real big sort of rapprochement towards China. Certainly during, many of these books came out during Park Geun-hye's time, as you point out. Now, I don't know that I completely agree with your assessment of the situation between Park Geun-hye and Xi Jinping, because on the one hand, Park Geun-hye, she tried really hard to speak Chinese to Xi Jinping, and Xi Jinping called Park Geun-hye, you are as though you are a Lao Pengyo. Lao Pengyo means old, sincere friend in Chinese, right? And she came back, and they exchanged gifts, and they came back really kind of very friendly atmosphere. But when the THAAD, T-H-A-A-D, was introduced, it was like the Chinese flipped their hand, and it was a slap in the face of Park Geun-hye, right? I mean, it's, all the you remember the Korean tourist industry went to nothing, and many of the Lotte, the Korean the convenience stores, and these stores were totally smashed, and anti-Korean demonstrations and so forth. So the Korean populace at the time, I was in Korea at the time, and they were all saying about Park Geun-hye, what are you doing with respect to China? You expect China to really come into our fold with respect to this particular situation. So I think, if anything, the Chinese are very, very anxious about having North Korea being pulled into the, so to say, the Western coalition, and the Western coalition being the United States with its allies, Japan and South Korea. If North Korea starts to move in this direction, China becomes very anxious, okay? So in this particular light, I think Moon Jae-in's leverage with respect to China has to be, it's not zero, he has some leverage, but it's not really large. I think the main actors are really going to be the United States and China. And you can see what's going on right now in terms of trade wars and the South China Sea and all these issues are very complicated, and the Korean Peninsula issue is just one piece of this huge puzzle. But it's really a game, a large game being played between these two powers. And South Korea is one of the facilitators in this particular picture, is the way I sort of see it.
Thank you very much, Kang-san. I think this wraps up our event. Great talk and great insights. Because you are a member, I cannot give you
honorary membership.
But the office kindly provided me with this wine to give you,
thank you
today, and I hope you can drinking over a celebration on the optimistic view you offered. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a nice evening.